On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, we talk Panama, the Panama Canal. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Fire up the Van Halen. What? How much do they want to play the song? Okay, we're not getting Van Halen's Panama. Panama. That's it. That's all I can afford. Sorry. This is a low budget operation here. What's going on with shipping? We do not have the money to pay for the copyright to play Van Halen's Panama, which I think is enough money to pay for David Lee Roth's retirement fund. All right. Today we want to talk about the Senate hearing that was done over the Commerce Committee on the Panama Canal based on President Trump's statement regarding this. We got a couple of stories on this topic that's out there. Mike Scholler did a piece over at G Captain. It's a great one. I'll have the link in the show notes for you. Then we got Greg Miller, a friend of the show over at Lloyd's List, did a full story on this. Why would U.S. invade Panama? The U.S. Senate hearings give rationale. Great breakdowns, but I want to go directly to the hearing and give you some snippets from those who testified. They had 4 people who testified in this hearing, 2 of them from the Federal Maritime Commission, 1 of them from the World Shipping Council, and then a law professor from Georgetown, also works with Heritage, who gave his interpretation of the treaty. Let's go to the opening remarks by Chairman Luis Sola. He is the new chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission. The former chairman is also testifying, Dan Maffei. He is testifying Donald Trump has changed who is the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission.
I bring a unique perspective as someone who's not only served as a maritime regulator, but also lived and worked extensively in Panama. I have transited the Panama Canal over 100 times. This experience provides me with a profound understanding of the canal's significance and challenges it faces. Prolonged drought conditions last year forced operational changes, reducing transit slots, restricting vessel types, and auctioning of slots, raising alarm about its resilience.
This is a Reuters story over at GCAP. Panama Canal defies drought with $3.45 billion profit despite fewer ships. Story goes on, adverse weather conditions reduced water available for the canal to operate, forced the authority to cut the number of ships authorized to pass per day between late 2023 and early 2024, while limiting maximum draft allowed. Goes on, a 5% reduction in operational costs helped the canal to ease the effect of the drought over its finances. Revenue increased by $18 million to $4.99 billion. So the drought that happened reduced the passage from the normal 36 ships at one point down to 22 ships. All right, if you're moving less ships through the canal, how then do you make more money? Well, a couple of reasons. One, they raise the tolls, so it's more expensive to go through. So we're looking at tolls anywhere from $50,000 to $300,000, depending on the size of the vessels that are going through. But more importantly, they started to auction off slots. So one of the things the Panama Canal was doing during this restricted period is you would book your slots ahead of time. Now, for passenger liners, for container ships, they can do this because they know their schedule. They're like the airlines. They know what days they're coming through. They got that in advance. However, oil tankers, LNG carriers, grain carriers don't work that way. They're the Uber of the shipping fleet. They sail when they get a load and they're able to go. They're arriving at the Panama Canal and getting online. And unfortunately, what happens is they get bumped to the end. But if you can bid and pay several $1 million for a space through, then you get to bump to the head of the line. Well, that's what's generating the revenue. And if you have a low-cost cargo like grain or something, you can't pay several $1 million to go through. But if you're waiting 2 weeks, 3 weeks to go through the canal, that grain could potentially spoil and you're seeing a loss. And this is that kind of unfair practices that is being referred to.
The Panama Canal is managed by the Panama Canal Authority, ACP, an independent agency of the Panamanian government. The ACP is a model of public infrastructure management, and its independence has been key to ensure a safe and reliable transit of vessels critical to the U.S. and global commerce. During my recent visit to Panama, I had the opportunity to meet with leaders of the ACP to better understand their efforts to address the ongoing challenges facing the canal. I saw firsthand their commitment to maintaining the canal's efficiency and resilience.
So the Panama Maritime Authority, the ACP, again, it's translated in Spanish, hence the acronym, is an independent agency under Panama government. Now, it is run by the Panama government. It is a separate kind of corporation. Almost imagine the U.S. Postal Service. It's separate. It's under the Panamanian government, and it runs itself. We transferred the canal to Panama, and not just the canal, but the entire canal zone. Remember, it wasn't just a canal we operated with the United States. We had a buffer of 25 miles on each side. All of that went in 1999. The treaty that was signed in 1979 by President Carter was ratified by the U.S. Senate. So 2/3 of the senators, 67 of them, had to approve this when it was done. And so the ACP is the one that's running the canal. The problem is there is a lot of Chinese interest in different facets of the canal.
In contrast, the broader maritime sector in Panama, including the nation's ports, water rights, and the world's largest ship registry, falls under the direct purview of the Panamanian government. Unfortunately, this sector has faced persistent challenges, including corruption scandals and foreign influence, particularly from Brazil and China. These issues create friction with the ACP, especially as it works to address long-term challenges, such as securing adequate water supplies for the canal.
So it's the influence of China and also Brazil that was mentioned there that's the big concern. So Panama is a massive maritime powerhouse. It really is. Right now, a Panamanian is the head of the International Maritime Organization. Panama has the largest ship registry in the world. Then you have the Panama Canal. But there are a lot of facets in Panama, too. It has major ports on both ends of the canal. There is an infrastructure program to build a fourth bridge over the Panama Canal. Panama was one of the very first countries to enroll in the Belt and Road Initiative by China. So there's massive Chinese investment in Panama. And so there's a lot of concerns about the fact that the Chinese are ever present now in Panama and their operations. However, as will be noted by the other commissioner that's talking here, this is not unlike what China has done in almost every other port and area around the world.
Although the ACP operates independently under U.S. law, both the ACP and the government of Panama's maritime sector are considered one and the same. This means that any challenges in Panama's maritime sector, including corruption, lack of transparency, or foreign influence, can have a direct or indirect impact on the operations and long-term stability of the canal. This legal perspective highlights the need for vigilance in monitoring both the ACP's management and Panama government's policies affecting maritime operations. Since 2015, Chinese companies have increased their presence and influence throughout Panama. Panama became a member of the Belt and Roads Initiative and ended its diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Chinese companies have been able to pursue billions of dollars in development contracts in Panama, many of which were projects directly on or adjacent to the Panama Canal. Many were no-bid contracts, labor laws were waived, and the Panamanian people are still waiting to see how they've been benefited. It is all more concerning that many of these companies are state-owned, and in some cases, even designated as linked to the People's Liberation Army. We must address the significant growing presence and influence of China throughout the Americas and in Panama specifically. American companies should play a leading role in enhancing the canal's infrastructure. By supporting U.S. firms, we reduce reliance on Chinese contractors and promote fair competition. Additionally, confirming a U.S. ambassador in Panama is critical to advancing our national and economic interests. The FMC will continue to monitor the canal's pricing practices and consider broad reviews of Panama's maritime sector. The FMC has the authority to impose significant remedies, including fines and restrictions on Panamanian flag vessels entering U.S. ports.
Just a couple of notes here by Chairman Sola in what he was saying. The contracts done by China often come with clauses that make them use their own workers. So when you build the fourth bridge over the canal, there will be encampments with barbed wire that separates the Chinese workers on there from everybody else. So you don't know who's on that workforce. Are they members of the Chinese government military? We don't know. We assume they're just workers, but you just don't know. And this comes with all Chinese contracts. When they do that, there's issues with the Chinese paying for these and giving money back to them. Understand, We, the United States, turned our back on Panama. When we gave the canal back in 1999, we really kind of broke our relationship with Panama in many ways. When Panama decided to build the third lane, we, the United States, didn't help contribute to that. We could have built a lane that could handle, for example, nuclear aircraft carriers so that we can swing carriers between the Atlantic and Pacific. Can't do that. We either have to send them through the Suez, past Acute, or around the southern tip of South America. We really did what we did with the maritime sector. We turned our back on them. And perhaps the biggest thing is the number of Panamanian ships that come in and out of U.S. ports. Because it is such a large registry, any sort of sanctions or issues against the Panama registry will resonate with Panama. And through the authority of the Federal Maritime Commission, he can enact that.
In closing, the Panama Canal is vital to our economy, with over 75% of its traffic bound for our ports. Safeguarding the ACP's independence and addressing the challenges posed by the broader government are essential to maintaining U.S. competitiveness in the global economy.
Maffei is the outgoing chairman of the FMC. President Trump has appointed Sola to take his spot. Sola is a Republican, and so now you have a Republican head of the committee.
Well, and members of the committee. I do want to say that in addition to Chairman Sola and myself, Commissioner Max Vekic is also here from the Federal Maritime Commission, which I just think underscores the importance of this issue.
That's Max over Dan's right shoulder right there. I've had a chance to meet both of them at events recently. Just enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to him. Actually got called out by Dan by name. I didn't think he knew who I was, but he did. So, here you go. The power of what's going on with shipping in real time.
More than 110 years after its opening, the Panama Canal does remain absolutely vital to maintaining resilient supply chains for both American importers and exporters. Because the canal is essentially a waterway bridge over mountainous terrain above sea level, it does depend on large supplies of fresh water to maintain the full operations. Panama has among the world's largest annual rainfalls. Nonetheless, insufficient freshwater levels have occurred before in the canal's history, such as in the 1930s when the Madden Dam and Lake Alajuela were built to address water shortages. Since that time, the canal has undertaken several projects to accommodate larger, more modern ships. In the last couple of years, a trend of worsening droughts in the region once again has forced limits to the operations of the canal. Starting in June of 2023, the Panama Canal Authority employed draft restrictions and reduced the number of ships allowed to transit the canal per day. Now, the Panama Canal limitations, in combination with the de facto closure of the Suez Canal to container traffic, has had serious consequences for ocean commerce, increasing rates, fees, and transit times. In the first half of 2024, U.S. importers and exporters expressed Panama Canal-related concerns to the FMC, including doubts about the future reliability of the canal and questions about how the Panama Canal Authority was determining which ships could transit the canal and how long they would have to wait. The FMC has statutory authority under the laws concerning foreign shipping practices to investigate and potentially take appropriate counteraction if it finds that a foreign country, through its laws or regulations, has contributed to, quote, conditions unfavorable to shipping in the foreign trade. So we traveled to Panama, actually it was in July of 2024, and we met with then recently elected President Jose Molino and officials in his administration. We also met with the Panama Canal Authority, as well as private sector stakeholders. We had very candid discussions on key issues such as Panama's plans to ameliorate the water level challenges, the bidding processes used to allocate transits during times of restrictions, and our concern the Canal Authority was bringing in far more revenue during the crisis than it had before limits were forced by the water shortages.
I don't want to play the other testimonies by the three witnesses. I'll have the full video linked down below, along with the transcripts that they used in their discussion. Instead, I want to go to the question and answering and jump around a little bit and focus on some key issues that came out from the opening comments. But more importantly, I want you to notice that a lot of the questions that are coming here, this is not just a pure Republican issue. A lot of the questions came from Democrats on this issue. So there is bipartisan concern about security in and around the Panama Canal. Remember, 75% of the cargo that goes through the Panama Canal is either destined to or from the United States.
Some press coverage says the Panama Canal is nominally independent, even though it provides a large share of the Panamanian government's revenue. Chairman Sola, briefly, can you describe how the FMC views the Canal Authority and the Panamanian government? Are they distinct entities or a single foreign government apparatus that controls the Panama Canal?
Mr. Chairman, our law is clear. It comes from the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 that there's only one entity
Hang on, we just had a Jones Act drop in the middle of that conversation. I deal all the time with people who tell me that the Jones Act, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, is just Section 27. It's not. There are multiple facets of the Jones Act. One is being talked about by Sola right now. That is the authority, Section 19 of the Jones Act, that deals with the FMC's ability to regulate international trade. Just wanted to make sure that everybody knows he's talking about the Jones Act, not the Jones section where everybody talks about the coastal trade.
In addition to that, our predecessor at the Federal Maritime Commission was the U.S. Shipping Board, was formed in 1916 in direct result of the Panama Canal. The very first chairman of that was George Washington Goethals, which was the very first administrator of the canal. So we look at it as one entity.
Panama also recently renewed the concessions for 2 container ports to a Chinese company, Hutchison Ports PPC. Of course, Chinese companies are controlled by the Communist Party. How does China use control of those ports for economic gain?
Mr. Chairman, I am a regulator, a competition regulator, and the Chinese ports that you're referring to, let me put them into scope. The one on the Pacific, the Port of Balboa, is roughly the same size as the Port of Houston. They do about 4 million containers a year. They have about 28 gantry cranes. The one on the Atlantic is the same as my hometown of Miami. They do about 1 million containers. So where Roger Gunther in the Port of Houston generates about $1 billion a year, and Heidi Webb in Miami does about 200 million, the Panama Ports Company paid zero for 20 years on that concession. So it's really hard to compete against zero.
So China controls 2 of the 5 container terminals in Panama, 1 on each side of the canal. There's 2 on the Pacific side, or the Gulf of Panama side, and then there's 3 on the Caribbean side, the Atlantic side. And as Chairman Sola just said there, because they had a 20-year concession from Panama, all the profits, all the money that was made in those terminals went back to China. None of it went into Panama. And what is a generating revenue with the comparison to the Port of Houston and the Port of Miami, that's not happening in Panama because these are basically state-owned operated ports. Now, they're operated through Hutchinson, and you have to go back and understand that this was a Hong Kong company at the time that they got the initial concession. So Hong Kong at the time, prior to 1997, was a British territory. Then it was turned back over to China. And now it's, while owned by an individual, still has connections to the Chinese government. And that is the concern that they have here. I want to go over to a question asked by Senator Cantwell, who's the ranking member from the Democratic Party on the Commerce Committee.
What about this audit, and could we push Panama on these issues of looking at closer U.S. infrastructure instead, particularly since, you know, the sea change here is like what everybody said. Like, everybody thought this was Hong Kong, then it turned into China. We didn't have an ambassador after that. Next thing you know, they've made more aggressive postures. They're making aggressive postures everywhere. That's why the United States saying no government backdoors in technology and getting 5 other technology nations and democracies to say the same thing and evangelize that every day is going to help us.
Yeah.
And so is the investment. But what about getting the stevedoring business or some of that back into proximity under the audit?
Well, it is the Panama Comptroller's Office, and they are investigating, contracts at Panamanian ports. And we don't have any jurisdiction over Panamanian ports per se. But your broader point, I think, is very, very important. While we were down there, both of us heard, I think, several times that the Panamanians would, the ones we talked to anyway, would welcome U.S. companies coming in and doing a lot of this work. Frankly, their bids are not competitive with the Chinese bids. Frankly, they're not that existent because the U.S. companies can make more money doing things other places. But even if they were existent, it is difficult to put competitive bids when the Chinese bids are so heavily subsidized by China. So you're absolutely right. This is a problem, and it's a problem in many, many other areas of the world that we can get into if you want in subsequent questions.
So I'm just going to echo what Senator Cantwell said there. We have neglected this, and therefore China fills the void. But the key thing that Commissioner Maffei said there is that it's hard to compete against China with their subsidies. They get massive amount of money from the government. and therefore they can lower their bids, and therefore they come in. And it's almost impossible on the international scale to do this. We see this in shipping, we see it in shipbuilding, and we see it in port operations. Again, if you just look at around the world, this is a Council on Foreign Relations report tracking China's control of overseas ports. We usually see those maps showing U.S. military presence around the world and where bases are. Chinese don't physically operate any military bases overseas except in one spot, and that's down here in Djibouti, where they have a naval presence down there. But the rest of these are Chinese interests in ports, including in the United States, where we see them having some interest right here on Seattle, and then down here at the Port of Los Angeles. But then again, we see them down here in Panama, down in this area. Matter of fact, one of the things that was mentioned by Chairman Sola was he was actually involved prior to his chairmanship and serving on the Federal Maritime Commission in a cruise terminal project down there, but he got shut out by the Chinese because the Chinese undercut his bid. He lost the land that he was going to use to develop this. Chairman Sola has a lot of experience and practice in the area of Panama. He's very well versed in this area, but you look at Chinese investment in ports, it is strategic. If you look at a port like Piraeus in particularly, where they control 2/3 of the port, this is massive. You see them down here at places like Felixstowe, and this becomes a major point that Commissioner Maffei talks about. Next questions come from Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat from Wisconsin. Senator Baldwin was one of the two senators from Wisconsin, but it was both senators, both her and Senator Johnson, that nominated Sean Duffy to become Secretary of Transportation. He just received his confirmation, so he is now Secretary of Transportation. During the hearing, it's Senator Baldwin who put a couple of questions to Commissioner Maffei on this.
But the Panama Canal is just one example of how far China's influence stretches. Their dominance in maritime, logistics, and shipbuilding sectors lessens competition, creates supply chain risks, and creates opportunities for surveillance and information gathering. In order to facilitate the movement of goods throughout the world, it's essential to have a secure and level playing field, which we currently don't. Chinese current practices do not allow for that. The United States Trade Representative recently investigated China's practices in the commercial shipbuilding sector under Section 301, and recently concluded that their dominance is a burden to United States commerce. A few decades back, we were the dominant country in commercial shipbuilding. In 2023, we built 5 commercial ships, and China built over 1,700, according to that investigation. So, what policies would you recommend to prioritize growth of the United States' influence in the maritime and logistics sector to compete with China and level the playing field?
I think the best I can answer in a short term is to amen to everything you said. And as an illustration, Senator Sullivan was talking about Hutchison Ports. That's actually the same company that runs terminals on both ends of the canal. I am concerned about that. However, if we want to be concerned about that, all of us should lose a lot more sleep than we're losing. Because if there's spies there, then there might be spies at other Hutchison ports. And there are other Hutchison ports in almost every part of the world. They own the largest container port in the United Kingdom, Felixstowe, which is responsible for nearly half of Britain's container trade. They control major maritime terminals in Argentina, Australia, the Bahamas, Germany, Indonesia, Mexico, Myanmar, the Netherlands, South Korea, and Tanzania. If owning and managing adjacent ports means that China somehow has operational control or strategic control over the Panama Canal, they also have it over the Suez, the Singapore Straits, the Mediterranean Sea, and the English Channel. That's just one aspect of what you were talking about. That doesn't include the shipbuilding, heavily subsidized, such that now I believe over half of new ships that are in the companies that belong to the World Shipping Council are coming from China, not because these are bad companies, but because they're undercutting other things. it's a problem that has been going on for 20 years, which makes it very difficult to answer your question. It is a long answer. This is not a problem that occurred last week. This is not something that President Trump identified. This was going on all of President Biden's term, but all of President Trump's first term. It has been going on for decades and decades through both U.S. Republicans and Democrats as president. The only thing I can say is I echo what Ranking Member Cantwell said, and I think others of both parties have echoed it, that we need some sort of overall maritime strategy. We have to acknowledge that this is part of our national security, that economic resilience is extraordinarily important, and I believe this is the greatest country in the world. I think if we start countering some of these efforts, we can do it, but it has to become a national priority. And part of the challenge is we're talking about outside the borders of our U.S. Investing outside the borders of our U.S. does not make a very good campaign ad, but it may be necessary to secure, particularly with such an aggressive and, frankly, on this, open strategy that China has had.
This is an issue that's been going on more than 20 years. I go back to the 80s when we started turning our back on the maritime infrastructure. We saw the end of subsidies for construction and operation of ships on the international trade. We saw the demise of the big U.S. shipping lines and literally the outsourcing of our global supply chain beyond the confines of the United States. Again, I don't think we should control 100% of it by any means. That's not what we're talking about here. But if you want to be a major power, which the United States is, you want to be a player in almost a quarter of the world's GDP, then your reliance on a supply chain that is controlled by groups that you have no oversight on could be a potential vulnerability. And as Dan just went down that list and talked about, if we're worried about Panama, there's a lot of other places we need to be worried about. In response to a question by Senator Schmidt, which was being talked about with the legality of the treaty.
You said that we all said that China had operational control. I don't believe that China currently has operational control over the Panama Canal. I'm not sure if any.
No, I didn't say all of you did. I said one of the witnesses.
All right. I will, but let me say this. I did agree that there was a threat posed by this ownership. I do think, though, that if your assumptions are correct, you are way understating the problem. That's right, understating the problem, because they also then control the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean Sea. And I actually have to admit, I'm a little confused as to why some of the senators asking these questions, Senator Blackburn, aren't more concerned about the biggest port in the United Kingdom being run by the Chinese. Petraeus in the port nearest Athens, one of the biggest ports in the Mediterranean, is not just run by a Chinese-linked company. It's run directly by a Chinese-owned company. And I was there. So you're on to something, but if you're just focusing on Panama, that's only part of it.
No, I agree with you. I think the difference here is that we gave it away. Huge mistake. Both Missouri senators voted for it back then. Huge mistake. But the one thing we got out of it, was a guarantee of neutrality, and that's the issue here.
So that issue of neutrality is extremely key, and they talk about it quite a bit in this hearing. Understand, you can't just repossess the Panama Canal. That's not the way this works. The treaty gave not just the canal away, but the land and all the infrastructure, everything away. And remember, it was Panama's to begin with. It was Panamanian to begin with. They gave us the concession of the canal and a 25-mile buffer on each side, and then we returned it. However, the key is the neutrality aspect. And if the perception is that neutrality is not being done, if there is being leverage against this, and I actually wrote a piece last year in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings. I'll have the link down below in the show notes and up above here for you to go to. In that piece, I talked about the concept that China may leverage the canal, Panama and Suez, that in case of a conflict, what if the Panamanians decided we get involved in a Taiwan conflict, to limit transits of U.S. ships through the canal? This map shows you the disposition of ships in what's called the Ready Reserve Force. These are the surge sealift vessels that the U.S. counts on to deploy units of the U.S. Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and even the Navy overseas. And ships are divided roughly a third on the East Coast, a third on the Gulf Coast, and a third on the Pacific Coast. This map isn't 100% accurate. Several ships have moved. The Algol and Capella now down in Beaumont. There's a new vessel, and one of the Cape S's is now on the West Coast. But basically, if you have to load out U.S. military forces out along the Gulf Coast, along the U.S. East Coast, or the Southeast Coast of the U.S., you need the Panama Canal. What if the canal decides, listen, there's a conflict going on between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. We don't want to be neutral. We want to be neutral. We want to be a neutral player here. And we're not going to allow you to deploy your military-laden assets through here. Remember, we just saw not too recently, did a whole video on this, on Spain refusing to allow ships of Maersk Lines Limited, a U.S. flag company, to come into the port of Algeciras and transload cargo to another vessel that was going to Israel because of what was happening in Gaza. What if this happens in the Panama Canal? 2/3 of our strategic sea lift forces would have to divert the long way to get to the West Coast. That is kind of a big concern.
I hope the administration will prioritize this ambassador spot as nominations are made. I hope we'll prioritize it in the Senate. My colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle will be warm to that nomination and moving it quickly. Something both parties, frankly, have fallen short on in recent years is prioritizing these. But other comments, Mr. Maffei?
Yeah, well, Senator, it won't surprise you since you and I served together in the House that I actually am pretty bipartisan. I agree with the chairman on what he said. I will say that that certainly we need to look at other kinds of ways to get U.S. companies in positions where they can truly compete with the Chinese and some of these things. And blaming it all on Panama, it really misses the point. I've seen the same thing in Greece, where Greece didn't want to give the concession of its largest port to a Chinese company, but because of its financial difficulties, it was getting pressure from international organizations such as the IMF, Europe, and even maybe some in the United States to do so. So I just ask you to look at that. And I do want to say one quick thing. You're right about the cost, and as I said before you were able to get here, the Panamanians are making far more on their canal than they ever had before. That's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it's going to the right place, but where they're really making the money is on these auctions, and that is why remains a concern of mine, I'm sure the chairman's, and that is where we are looking at potentially are using our authority under Section 19 of the Merchant Marine Act, where we could, if we can show that it is basically a problem with the foreign trade of the U.S., it's interfering with foreign trade of the U.S., there are certain things that we can do.
Once again, the Jones Act making its play here. Section 19 of the Jones Act, Merchant Marine Act of 1920. This is why it's really important. I joke about this, but it's really important to put back a national maritime strategy, much like the original Jones Act was. It contained multitude of sections, 32 sections, that covered a myriad of things, not just coastal trade, shipbuilding, regulatory issues, seafarers' rights, you name it. Very important document.
Well, and I'll say that this hearing has been a nice bipartisan demonstration of a lot of expertise. There's a reason you guys have your the role you have, because you know what you're talking about.
So the focus I've given you obviously is a little bit just on the shipping side. I didn't get really into the treaty side. I didn't talk about the World Shipping Council either, talking about the commercial side, but I think I really wanted to highlight the key issue here, which is the security aspect of what is happening. And again, I recommend the full hearing for you. I've got those articles you can take a look at that go in some more detail about it. Suffice it to say, based on the hearing, that if the U.S. does view that the neutrality of the canal is in jeopardy, one of the things that both commissioners from the Federal Maritime Commission said is that there are mechanisms the U.S. could use to put pressure against the Panamanians to do this. It does not require the 82nd Airborne parachuting in Operation, Just Cause Part 2. That's not what we need. We don't need to stage another invasion of Panama. That's not what we're talking about. There are mechanisms within the Federal Maritime Commission through the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 that can be implemented. The FMC came out of the Shipping Act of 1916 as part of the U.S. Shipping Board. It got more powers under the 1920 Act and further powers as it went on. It was separated out from what is today the Maritime Administration in 1961. And then you had the Shipping Act of 1984. You had the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 1998. And then the most recent one was the 2022 Act. So there is power within there. There is a vacant seat right now in the commission. So President Trump has to fill that seat sooner rather than later. And I think one of the most important things I heard come out of this was really the need to get a U.S. ambassador in that position down in Panama, and for more U.S. interest in the area. It may be worth looking at, having the ambassador there, maybe more of a U.S. military presence down there, but talking more. The point is, the U.S. has vacated its point, and along with many other nations, let's be clear, there's other nations around the world who have kind of backed away from ocean shipping, and that has allowed the Chinese to kind of fill the void. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you can hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly and yearly subscriber. I obviously need this money so that I can copyright Van Halen songs because they're friggin' expensive. I mean, seriously, I'm going to have to become a music sensation. I think that's obviously the choice here, because copywriting music is the way to go. Till the next episode, this is Sal.